Okay, I'm Rebecca Gray. This is a virtual coffee with Pratibha Agarwal, sponsored by the Entrepreneur's Lawyer, which is a collection of tools and resources for startup general counsel. And Pratibha, I will let you introduce yourself. Thanks so much for joining us.
I'm happy to be here. Thanks for having me, Rebecca. As Rebecca said, I'm Pratibha Agarwal. I'm an immigration attorney, and we help clients in all aspects of immigration law. My firm is based right outside of Washington, D.C. in Arlington, Virginia, but immigration actually is a federal practice, so we're able to help clients all throughout the United States. Thanks for having me.
Yay.
Get started. Great.
So the first thing that came to mind for me was like, what are we not allowed to ask? What are we allowed to ask when we're interviewing job candidates?
Yeah, that's actually a really, really good question. And it's something that could kind of get you in trouble if you don't know what not to do. What we recommend to our clients is you're allowed to ask kind of two questions. The first one is really, what if you're offered the position, will you be able to show that you're authorized to work in the United States? So they don't necessarily need to show it at the interview. I wouldn't necessarily ask for it at the interview, but if offered the position, would you be able to show that you're authorized to work in the United States? And then also, will they need sponsorship in the future? You can ask that as well.
Okay. And if they do need sponsorship, what kind of internal processes do you recommend there?
It's just something to keep track of. That they will need to be authorized to work in the U.S. before you hire them, or when you hire them, they'll need to show that they're authorized to work in the U.S. And if they need sponsorship in the future, it's just something to consider for yourself. You're not required to hire them if that's not something your company is willing to take on.
Okay. What about once you've actually hired them?
So once you've hired, the first thing you need to do is verify that they are authorized to work in the U.S. And so this is obviously a quick overview and a summary, so you can get more in depth into it. But essentially, a U.S. citizen is always authorized to work in the U.S. And they can show that through either a birth certificate or a U.S. passport. A green card holder is allowed to live permanently in the U.S. and work permanently in the U.S. If they have a green card, that's fine too. The other most common document is the employment authorization document, and they can receive that through various different ways. So asylum holders can receive that. Family-based options can sometimes provide that as well. So if they have an employment authorization document, it's just a card. They can work. They have authorization to work as well. With that, it does expire, so you will need to monitor when it expires and make sure you ask for authorization once, if you see that it's expiring. Other types of visas that will allow them to work are usually like an H-1B or an O visa, and your company will need to sponsor that, and student visas as well. But that will come with an employment authorization document. But with an H-1B, you'll know that they're authorized to work because your company will have to be involved in sponsoring that.
So I had no idea what an employment authorization document looks like, or like how to tell if a visa authorizes work. So I actually went to the USCIS website to look at samples, and these were some of them. One of the things that surprised me is that a social security card that doesn't say you can't work in the United States actually means you can. So that surprised me. These are all documents that apparently count for I-9 purposes.
Yeah, so I'm gonna disagree in this. The Social Security alone is not going to help you qualify for work authorization. So, for example, we have this employment authorization document over here. You see it on the right side of my screen. That has an expiration date. That is a valid document. You have a green card at the bottom left. That is a valid document. The USCIS actually has a great resource online. It's just basically instructions on how to verify that someone is able to work in the US. So a child could have a social security number. It doesn't actually mean that they're authorized to work in the US, right? So there's different, so you can get a social security number and not be authorized to work. So that's just something to keep in mind. That alone is not sufficient. Also, a visa document like this, what you see here, that is essentially an entry document. This is the one in the middle. it's an entry document, and it allows them to enter the US, but that alone doesn't provide any kind of work authorization either. So what
So,
you're looking for is really an employment authorization document, a green card, a US citizen, and then if you've sponsored them, you'll know that obviously. So that type of visa, like an H-1B or an O-1 that requires employment-based sponsorship, that would qualify as well.
so what this says to me is that this is not a do-it-yourself process, because I pulled all of these from the list on USCIS as like work authorization documents. I'm thinking you need expert advice if you're looking at anything other than the obvious.
Yeah, at least in the beginning. If you're unfamiliar with this process, I would say you should probably consult an immigration lawyer just to make sure you're not hiring someone that's not authorized to work in the US. And actually, we within our firm have seen companies that have hired based on this visa document in the middle, just not knowing whether or not that was okay as documentation, right? So it can be a little bit misleading.
So as startup general counsel, for instance, you're probably going to want to get some training and processes in place so that, if you're looking at this, you're great. If you're looking at that, you probably need to ask more questions.
Exactly.
Cool.
All right. Well, with all of these complications, you probably are wondering why hire for any international workers at all. It's so complex, right? So I agree, it is complicated, but the clients that we have seek international workers for various reasons. One, the main reason I would say is many of these qualified workers are in the tech industry, and in the US, we just don't have enough graduates or enough people with the skills necessary to work in these tech jobs. Also, some require foreign language options, foreign language abilities. So that also is something that you'd want to consider. And then in some visa types, there's not even necessarily, other than local labor laws that might impose a minimum wage, there's no federal wage requirement for people on certain student visas. So they don't necessarily have to be paid. And what they're here for really is because they want to stay in the United States. They want to gain work experience. So they're really, really devoted to the company and are incredibly motivated to do a good job. So that kind of work ethic is not always found in the US. So those are the main reasons I would think a company would be interested in hiring or sponsoring an international worker.
This is one that really surprised me too, that you actually do not have to pay them at all.
Yeah. So for the first year, so usually OPT, we'll get more in depth in a second, but OPT is actually the first year after someone graduates from a US university. They're allowed to be here for 1 year after graduation and work and gain experience in the field that they studied. And they don't actually need to be paid. So that's something for employers to consider, especially startups that may have a limited budget. That's something for them to consider in terms of getting someone with the required skills, and then later on decide whether they want to sponsor them for different visa types or even a green card. Great. Should I keep going?
Yeah.
Okay.
Since you're controlling the slides,
I'm controlling this one.
Talk to us about the student visas then.
Great. So so student visas are a very common type of employment authorization. There are two main types to kind of be aware of, right? So there's CPT, which stands for curricular practical training, and this is work experience or authorization to work while the person is enrolled in school. So some programs have to be CPT approved, and they will be authorized to work while they are in school. So it has to be related to their degree. OPT is the most common one that we see in terms of student visas and work authorization. So OPT is what I just mentioned about the first year after they graduate. They have 1 year to get on-the-job experience that relates to their degree. So there's no wage requirement for that. So that's something you can consider. For people on OPT with a STEM degree, so USCIS publishes a list of degrees that qualify for a STEM extension. So if the degree is on that list, after that 1 year, the candidate can apply for 2 additional years of being able to work in the United States. So that's only for people with STEM degrees, and that does have a wage requirement. So they have to be paid. It doesn't have a particular wage requirement, but they do have to be paid. And the employer is involved in filling out a training plan, essentially coordinating with the school and the candidate, and talking about what the job duties are going to be and how they relate to the degree. So the STEM is a little bit more limited in the sense that they do have to be paid, but just regular OPT does not have does not have a prevailing wage requirement. They don't necessarily have to be paid at all, but of course comply with local labor laws if they do require that the candidate needs to be paid a minimum wage.
So if I'm running, say, a tech startup and I've got someone who's coming in maybe part-time while they're in school under CPT, and then we have them for a year, maybe unpaid even, which sounds awful. But if it's someone who actually has the resources to do that and wants to, that's an option. For OPT, and then they qualify for that STEM extension. Is the wage that they are paid determined externally, or is it just a federal minimum wage? How does that work?
It's determined by the company. So the company will necessarily need to pay attention to local labor laws. So they may be talking to an immigration attorney and also an employment attorney to figure out what they must pay. But generally, the company decides, and there's no certain wage requirement, just at least with regard to immigration laws, that they would need to pay for the STEM OPT extension.
And I'm assuming that by the time we've got someone for a year and we know we want to extend, it's probably time then to start thinking about an H-1B. Is that right?
Yep, absolutely. So that takes us to our next slide here on what is involved in sponsoring an H-1B. So you'll encounter H-1Bs in two specific circumstances, right? So the first one could be an OPT, someone on OPT or STEM OPT that is looking for your company to sponsor an H-1B for the first time. And the second scenario is essentially the person has an H-1B already working with a different company and they now want to come and work with you. In the first scenario, what you need to keep in mind is you can only apply for the H-1B at certain times of the year. So that's very, very important to know. So if you're thinking about sponsoring an H-1B, you can really only do it April 1st of that year. And the person starts working on that H-1B October 1st of that same year. So you enter them into a lottery. There are only 85,000 visas available that you enter them into the lottery in March. So for companies that are considering this, you might want to get that process started now. Find your attorney, get your materials ready. So you usually start. I would recommend January, February is the time that you essentially figure out whether or not you're going to sponsor someone. You enter them in the lottery in March, and then the lottery is run between March 20th and April 1st of each year. And you'll find out if your candidate was picked in the lottery, and then you have time to submit the full H-1B application. If approved, the applicant, the beneficiary, will be able to start October 1st of that same year. So you have to keep in mind, they have to maintain status up until October 1st of that year.
So if they're on OPT or STEM OPT, and that's going to run out in like May of this year, then is there going to be a gap before they can work under the H-1B?
So the USCIS has factored that because a lot of people on STEM OPT or OPT are the ones that are entering into the H-1B lottery. So there's what's called a cap gap extension. So essentially, if it expires somewhere in between, somewhere in the summer, let's say, before the H-1B period starts, they automatically will extend that status, that OPT status, all the way until the H-1B takes effect. So
that's great.
So actually, let me clarify, all the way until September 30th, right? So sometimes USCIS is processing and taking a longer time to approve that H-1B. That cap gap extension doesn't go beyond September 30th. So the person will actually need to stop working if they don't have any other status until the H-1B is approved.
And so what kinds of wage requirements are involved with an H-1B?
So with an H-1B, it's a little bit more regulated. So you can essentially, the employer will draft the job duties and we'll figure out it's so complicated. So I'll try to summarize as best as I can. Right?
What's the quick and dirty?
The quick and dirty. So there's what's called, the Department of Labor publishes what's called the Occupational Outlook Handbook, the OOH. So what you want to do is match your occupation to something in the OOH. So you would look at that. And then the Department of Labor has also published, right? So not every single occupation is going to have an exact match. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. So then you go and look at another site that the Department of Labor has that essentially tells you this position in this location needs to be paid X amount. So the employer then has to pay at minimum that amount or higher. So it's, it's something that you decide, like maybe I don't want to put this person in a supervisory role because I can only afford to pay them 65,000 and not 80,000. So it's something to figure out between the employer and the attorney, what's going to qualify for the H-1B and what the employer can afford as well.
Okay. And you can't stay on an H-1B forever. So what's next and how far in advance do you need to plan? And is it the same wage requirements?
Yeah, so you can't be on an H-1B forever. So it's 3 years. You can ask for 3 years at a time with a 6-year max. And then you have to basically consider whether or not you're going to be sponsoring that green card, which is a more complex process and can take anywhere between 2 to 2.5 years in some cases to get the green card. Some countries have a really long wait time for a green card to be available. So if you have someone from India, for example, the full green card process, they won't actually have a green card in hand for 10 years. So they could extend their H-1B beyond that 6 years, but you will have to have the green card process underway for that to be available.
Oh, how long can you extend an H-1B if you've got a green card pending?
Forever, really. So if you're in a certain phase of the green card process, you can just continue extending it until the green card based visa, becomes available.
Okay. So how far in advance then? Because I was thinking, oh my gosh, if you've got someone who's starting the 3 to 6 year H-1B and it takes that long to get a green card, do you need to start like the day after you get the H-1B? How far?
Since the H-1B can go on for 6 years, I'd probably start like before you do the extension for the second H-1B. Or I mean, you can start even before that if you want to, if you just want to have it underway, and make sure it gets approved. But the green card is complicated, as you can see.
Yeah. Walk us through
it. Sure. Yeah. So the first part of the green card process actually doesn't really involve the candidate so much at all. So essentially the company, it's called PERM, if you've heard of it. The company here has to show that, he basically has to show that I've tried to recruit US workers for this position and there are no US workers available for the position. So that's the entire gist of PERM. It has multiple different steps. So the first step, at least the way our firm does it, you can do it different ways. I would say this is the most conservative way of doing it. So you essentially go through the candidate's qualifications, and you go through the job description and you figure out what the minimum qualifications are for that position. You take that and you submit it to the Department of Labor, and they will issue what's called a prevailing wage determination, telling you you need to be paid X amount, that this is the minimum that they need to be paid for this position in this location. So it's based on the job duties as well as the location of employment. So once they issue the prevailing wage determination, the company goes through recruitment, and certain recruitment methods are regulated. They're mandatory for all positions, and others you can choose from through a list. So essentially for most positions that require a bachelor's degree or higher, for example, you'll really need to do some Sunday newspaper ads, which can be antiquated, and also very expensive.
I'm thinking who actually reads the Sunday papers anymore, but.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, exactly. So essentially you have to go through this whole process that is a little bit antiquated, but it's required. So you'll go through this whole recruiting process, and then after it's done, we submit the application to the Department of Labor to certify that we actually went through the required recruitment process, and we couldn't find anybody to satisfy this job, to basically, take over this job position.
And then the real process begins, right?
Yeah. So that can take a while. So that whole process is going to take at least a year. And then the next step is sponsoring. So essentially this is the easier part. So you're showing that the company can support the prevailing wage, and that the candidate, is not a terrorist essentially, and doesn't have communicable diseases and those types of things. So this is the easier part
Yeah.
of the green card process, but the perm is the more involved, regulated portion.
I noted that you talked about, as far as candidate admissibility goes, the visa availability. What happens if there's a 10-year wait list for visas from that particular country? I mean, and you've already got them working for you. Can you extend an H-1B because
Yeah,
of
so you can continue
list?
extending the H-1B when we get kind of up to stage 2, is the most common way that our firm will handle it. So
Okay.
essentially, once you file this application about the company, showing that the company is able to, to support this wage, that they're established enough, that they're a real company, this is a real job. Once you submit that and that gets approved, we continue extending the H-1B after that. There are different ways to extend the H-1B, but I think the short and easy is that one.
So you could actually be on an H-1B for an extremely long time,
Yeah,
depending on how this all shakes out with the visa availability. Okay.
exactly.
So what does the normal process look like?
So this is what we see most often. So employers will hire someone either most of the time on OPT or STEM OPT, and the candidate will be working for them on STEM OPT or OPT. Because of the H-1B lottery, because it's on a lottery system, you don't know if you're going to get selected. So you basically want to start applying for that H-1B so you have more options, right? So if you like the person, essentially as soon as they're eligible for an H-1B, so in March, following the year that they've started, I would enter them in the H-1B lottery. If they get picked, great, apply for the H-1B. If they don't get picked, try again the next year. So that's what I would suggest. So essentially we see STEM OPT, OPT, and then the employer enters them in the lottery and sponsors the H-1B, and then eventually goes to the green card, the employer-based green card.
Okay, and the STEM OPT folks will just have more bites at the H-1B lottery apple, basically?
Yeah, just because they have 3 years already on STEM OPT. So the other thing we see is, let's say you're on OPT, you don't get picked, because OPT, again, remember, is 1 year. So you don't get picked for the H-1B, don't get picked for the lottery, they'll go back to school. So that's complicated. They'll go back to school and continue working on CPT, and submit again the next year for the H-1B lottery. So
So
it can be a little bit of a complex
how
process.
many PhDs can you get, basically?
Exactly. And it's very frustrating because it's obviously not easy to work and be in school at the same time, and they would be required to do that. But that goes to show exactly that a lot of international employees are just so devoted and hardworking that it might be worth it to go through this process.
Okay. Well, what do we do if they have additional questions?
They can call me. Here's my information.
Pratibha, thank you so much for spending a few moments here on our second virtual coffee with the Entrepreneur's Lawyer. And yeah, hopefully this has been helpful. I know it has been for me, and we'll talk again soon.